Now, I want to say off the top here that I wanted to do a look at the Washington Capitals' best season where they didn't win a Stanley Cup. And I didn't want to look at the Ovechkin era because we've talked about the Ovechkin era a lot. We've lived it, right? There are going to be people watching this who didn't live through the era the Capitals had before that, where they had a lot of success, but it didn't translate in the postseason. And the interesting thing is, these were not bad teams. They're not remembered as great teams, and honestly, this was a roster that was just stuck in the wrong division, and it's been on my mind as well because there's a lot of talk about Toronto and Boston and Tampa and how they're all clumped into this really good division, and it's not really fair. Back in the '80s, the Patrick division, that's where that resided for years, and there was not a change in NHL policy at any point. This was where division rivals met each other in the first and second round, and ultimately that was the undoing of the Washington Capitals. This is a team that I think would have got out of the second round, but they just couldn't get past the tough competition they had. This is also a video I'm doing with actual just natural light. Studio lights are off. Now, for spotlight purposes, 83-84, 84-85, and 85-86, they had 100 points those seasons. Now, there were no 3-point games. So by today's standards, this would be 110, 115 points. So 110, 110, 115 kind of thing. Just adding 8 extra points for overtimes and shootouts. And that's just, it'd probably be more than that. So 48 wins, 46 wins, 50 wins, averages out to 48 a season, 101, 101, 107 points. Now, the first season, they lost their first seven games overall. So they were 0-7 to start the season. That's it. Now, going into the 83-84 season, this was a Capitals franchise that was known for being bad. And though they looked like they might be turning the corner at the start of that season, it didn't look like it was going to get any better. They turned it around. They win 48 games from there, and they have a very solid record. In the 84-85 season, Bobby Carpenter scores 53 goals, ends up with 95 points. He is the first U.S.-born 50-goal scorer in NHL history. Not in the Hall of Fame, because I don't think he ever did it again. I'm pretty sure he didn't. He set the bar too high. He's one of those guys who does that. He has the big season, and then the bar's up here, and you can never quite get there again. He had a very good career. I've been meaning to put him in the THG Hall of Fame if I haven't already. But anyways, that's beside the point. They had, in those 3 seasons, they had 6 20-goal scorers in 83-84, 5 in 84-85, and 7 in 85-86. 50-point scorers, they had 6 every year for those 3 seasons. They were a dominant team. They were one of the best teams in the league. Hall of Fame talent, they had that. For most of this run, they had Mike Gartner, Larry Murphy, Scott Stevens, and Rod Langway. 3 Hall of Fame defensemen. You had Stevens, one of the best bruising defensemen in the league. Larry Murphy, one of the best offensive defensemen in the league. And Rod Langway, just the best defensive defenseman. One of the best defensive defensemen I've ever seen in my lifetime, and just absolutely dominant at shutting other players down. Now, when you look at it, this is a roster that should have been capable of winning a Stanley Cup. If you look at their goaltending tandems for those 3 dominant years, Al Jensen and Pat Riggin are the goaltenders in 83-84. Riggin, Jensen, and Mason share the crease in 85-86, and Jensen and Pete Peters, 85-86. Al Jensen was a goaltender who put up really good stats. Playoffs, it didn't quite work out for him. But again, look who they're up against, and we'll get into that. Because while I had this idea of talking about just the 3 dominant seasons, I thought, you know what? I should talk about that whole era, because there are 2 guys who dominated. David Poyles, the general manager, is the general manager of the Washington Capitals from August of 1982. When he took over, this team was a joke, until March 1997, and when he left, they had been at the Stanley Cup Finals. They'd been very close to winning it. Coach Brian Murray from 81-82 to 89-90, and I remember at the time feeling like Murray was a good coach. I didn't know whether he was a good enough coach to win it all. And I had that feeling throughout. And he and his brother Terry both coached. They were both successful regular season, postseason. Sometimes turned out to be a different story. So overall, this was a Washington team that was very successful. But we don't remember them as being much of anything because this was the Oilers era, the Islanders era before that. What stopped them during this time, because what we're looking at is the year that the Islanders dynasty ends, is their division. They never got a chance to play against the Oilers, so we have no idea how a series between them and the Oilers might have gone. They had Gartner, a guy who could score 50 goals in his sleep, one of the fastest players in history, and as I said, they had 3 Hall of Fame defensemen on that blue line. Maybe part of the reason they don't get over that hump is because they didn't have a Billy Smith in net. They didn't have a Ron Hextall. But I don't know. It's just one of those things, right? 1984, they finished second in the Patrick Division to the New York Islanders. They're 5th overall in the NHL out of 21 teams. 1985, they're second in the Patrick again to Philadelphia. They're number 3 overall in the NHL. 1986, they're second in the Patrick again to Philadelphia. They are number 3 overall in the NHL. 1987, they're second in the Patrick Division to, right, Philadelphia. You guys are getting this down. They were number 7 overall that year in the NHL. That's why I don't have the 87 season up there. They finished with 92 points that year, which is the equivalent of 100-plus points in this era. 1988, they finished 3rd in the Patrick to the Islanders and Philadelphia. They were number 8 in the NHL. 1989, they finished 1st in the Patrick Division, 3rd overall in the NHL. The year after that, they ended up below 500. So this was a team that was on a pretty good, steady run. And then something happened to change that. And it was just, in my opinion, I think losing Scott Stevens played a role in that. Now, when you look at their playoff runs, 1984, round 1, they knock out the Flyers in 3 because it was a best of 5. Round 2, best of 7. They lose in 5 to the New York Islanders. The New York Islanders, who are in the midst of winning 19 straight series before they will drop the 1984 finals against the Edmonton Oilers, the same team they defeated in 83. Now, when you look at scoring leaders from that playoff run, Mike Gartner, 8 games played, 3 goals, 7 assists. Dave Christian, 8 games played, 5 goals, 4 assists. And Scott Stevens, 8 games played, 1 goal, 8 assists. And Stevens will go on to win Stanley Cups, just not with Washington. 1985, they lose round 1 against the Islanders in 5. So the Islanders, the bane of their existence for that second time. Gartner, 5 games played, 3 goals, 4 assists for him. Murphy, 5 games played, 2 goals, 3 assists. You'll notice Gartner produced in the playoffs. Mike Gartner, not remembered as a guy who did, and of course, famously was on the New York Rangers in 94, and they trade him before they go on to win the Stanley Cup. That was as close as he would come. 1986, they beat the New York Islanders in round 1 in 3 straight. Awesome. And then they lose in the second round to the Rangers in 6. That year, Gartner played 9 games, 2 goals, 10 assists for him. Stevens, 9 games played, 3 goals, 8 assists. 1987, they lost in 7, and this was heartbreaking. This was the game that went on forever. That was my first exposure to a really, really long playoff game. And Bob Mason was in net for the Washington Capitals, Kelly Hrudey at the other end. And famously, Pat LaFontaine ends it. And the Capitals dropped the series in 7 overall. Now, for that series, Gartner, 7 games played, 4 goals, 3 assists. Scott Stevens, 7 games played, 5 assists. So again, your best players are your best players in the playoffs if you're Washington. But already at that point, they've got this reputation that they can't win the big one. 1988, round 1, they knock out the Flyers. So the Flyers, who had gone to the Stanley Cup final in 87, get knocked out in the first round by the Capitals in 7 and 88. Maybe this is going to be different, especially since they're against the Devils in the second round, and the Devils, an upstart team with this young goalie, Sean Burke. Nope. They lost to the Devils in 7. It was part of that whole Sean Burke mystique. It would get quashed in the semifinals by the Boston Bruins, but Burke looked pretty darn solid and helped to steal that series against the Washington Capitals. Your leading scorers from that team, Bent Gustafson, 14 games, 4 goals, 9 assists, and Michael Pavanka with 14 games played, also with 4 goals and 9 assists. So now is the time when there's some frustration. And it's kind of boiling over because this team continues to be excellent, but not quite good enough. And the questions about Gartner and whether or not he's really the guy starts to come out. 89, they lost in the first round to Philadelphia in 6. Their leading scorers, Jeff Courtnall, 6 games played, 2 goals, 5 assists, and Dino Ciccarelli, 6 games played, 3 goals, 3 assists. You'll notice he's not here, although he's a Hall of Famer. Why? Because they traded a Hall of Famer to get him. Mike Gartner and Larry Murphy, 2 Hall of Famers, are traded to Minnesota for Dino Ciccarelli and Bob Rouse, March 7th of 1989. In my opinion, that was where things shifted down for the Washington Capitals and would take them a few more years to come back up. Now, yes, David Poile would go on to put together a team for Washington that would get to the Stanley Cup Finals. But that Dino Ciccarelli trade is abysmal. And as a fan of the Minnesota North Stars, I like that trade a lot. And I think that played a role in their falling back in 1989, 1990. They fall down to 78 points. So it was a dramatic drop from first place in the Patrick Division, number 3 overall in the NHL, and the following season they're below 500. And when they fell below 500, that was the end for Brian Murray. He ends up finding himself out of work after the 89-90 season. But I don't imagine it was his fault. And this is part of the reason why now, I know Dino Ciccarelli and Scotty Bowman get along now, but I would imagine this is part of the reason why Bowman would later say that Ciccarelli was kind of an anchor for Detroit as well, and that no team would win with Dino Ciccarelli. I remember him talking about it, quite animated between the two. They've all made up now. Bowman played a role in getting Dino into the Hall of Fame, but it definitely ushered in an era where Washington wasn't quite at the level that they had been under Mike Gartner. But there you go. Just looking at the Washington Capitals of the mid-late 80s. A team that was, I thought, pretty solid, but because they were in the same division as the Philadelphia Flyers and New York Islanders, they never got out of the second round. And there was no calls I can remember at the time for having them play Hartford or Quebec or one of the weaker teams in the Adams division, though they likely would have at least reached a conference final if we'd had that kind of setup back then. All right, there you go. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below as always. Thank you guys so much for watching. And hey, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. I will put this into the playlist I started on great seasons without Stanley Cups. But don't be surprised if there's great seasons without Stanley Cups and pretty great eras that just didn't end up translating to a Stanley Cup. So there you go. The Washington Capitals, a team that I don't have to do a video on them not winning a cup now because they did. But this is the era that caused me to have a lot of reservations, I should say, about saying the Caps are going to win because they were just snake bit. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll talk to you again soon.